Hi everyone, it's Mr. Rust. This is Lesson 4 of Module 3, The American Revolution, entitled Winning the War. The big idea in this final section of Chapter 3, or Module 3, is that strategic victories in the South and at Yorktown enabled the Americans to defeat the British. Now, why it matters now, they say, is because the American defeat of the British established the United States as an independent nation. And that is true. It absolutely is true. And this is one of the more significant events in not only American history, but world history. The establishment of a country like the United States based upon the idea that people can govern themselves was unique in human history at that time. And it has inspired similar revolutions and similar governments since that time. Some key terms for you to know are Yorktown, the final battle of the Revolution, the Marquis de Lafayette, who helped to train and fight alongside the Continental Army, and Frederick von Steuben, whose military training techniques are still used today in boot camp for the United States Army. Charles Cornwallis, who was the British field general defeated at Yorktown, and the Treaty of Paris, which was the agreement that officially ended the war, followed by egalitarianism, which is the idea that all people are equal. So here at the beginning of this final section of Module 3, we read about how the American Revolution ends with the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. And there is a picture of Cornwallis surrendering his sword to George Washington. Now, this victory begins with the story of how the European allies shifted the balance. And we have to remember that the victory over the British by the Americans would not have been possible without the support and money and training and men supplied by France. Ironic, because the French king who helped the Americans win the war would ultimately be killed by the same revolutionary ideas that he helped to foster in this revolution. You see, the American Revolution inspired the French Revolution just a few years later. And so here, the French alliance, we read about the French military leader, the Marquis de Lafayette, who came over to the colonies and helped to not only bring money and men with him, but also to join Washington's staff and advise him on how to fight the war. Frederick von Steuben also came over from Prussia, which is today in Germany, and he brought with him the training needed to make these farm boys into soldiers. And like I said, many of his techniques are still used by the military today. Now notice as we go through that there's a reading check here. You always want to make sure that you do the reading checks to make sure you understand what's being asked of you in the text, that you get the main idea. And here is finding the main idea. Who were some of the European allies that came to the aid of the colonies? And we know that it would be, of course, the French and the Prussians. Now, the British move south is a direct result of what we read about in Lesson 3, the victory at Saratoga. After losing in New York at Saratoga, the British decided they would be more successful if they fought in the south, where there were fewer people for them to control. And this was a successful strategy, and they did. But by 1781, the British are starting to lose more and more people, and the war is becoming more and more expensive, and they're starting to begin to think that maybe it's not worth it. And so when they start to move northward into Virginia, they are ultimately surrounded by the French. Lord Cornwallis is forced to surrender to George Washington at Yorktown, and the war is essentially over. And there is the victory at Yorktown. Now, that ends the fighting, but then we seek peace in this section right here, in which we learn about how a team of negotiators, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams, all organized the final peace talks with the British that led to the signing of the Treaty of Paris that confirmed the new boundaries of the United States as well as its independence from Great Britain. Notice, too, there is a reading check here asking what issues did the Treaty of Paris leave unresolved? It left unresolved, for example, the issue of Native Americans. It didn't explain whether Native Americans would be taken out of American territory or left in there, and what rights they might have. It also did not clear up the issue of debts that British creditors were owed by Americans, and didn't answer the question about loyalists, who many of which were violently attacked and forced to flee the new United States of America. Now, in the final section here, you read about how the war becomes a symbol of liberty, right? The American victory in the war really showed that ideas matter, and that ideas about egalitarianism or equality could lead to other people being inspired to have their own government where people were the center of power and not divine kings. Please don't skip the section you see here called Document-Based Investigation Historical Resource. This is an important one for you to analyze the map that you see here and to think about the question about whether Americans wanted to have maps made of the United States, why they might want that. And please try to notice the extent to which these colonies claimed land all the way from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, and why they would want to do that. There will most likely be a map question on your test, and so be ready for that. Now, the impact on American society, well, Americans really bought into this idea of egalitarianism, and they wanted to see more equality for not just rich white landowning men, but for poor farmers and urban workers and people who didn't own land. Nobody was calling for the emancipation of African American slaves, unfortunately, but there were a lot of calls for women to be given equal rights, something that the white landowning, slave-owning men would not actually do. And so women were betrayed at the very beginning of the American society, the American state. Slavery was something nobody wanted to get rid of because the southern states wouldn't stay part of this new government if they were forced to give up their slaves. It was a deal breaker for them. Slavery was so important to the economy of the United States that the northern representatives didn't want to challenge the southern representatives to the Continental Congress to make them give up their slaves. And so this meant that there were some free blacks, but there was a vast number of enslaved African Americans left without any equality after the fighting, showing the hypocrisy and the unevenness of the American success in the Revolutionary War. So as we come down to the end of this chapter, end of this section, please make sure that you analyze the reading check here. It asks, what were the exceptions to the spirit of egalitarianism that rose after the Revolutionary War? I just talked about that. And do yourself a favor, in your digital text, please try and do the review section at the end of this section to help you prepare for your test on this chapter and on this section. These questions that you see here, the lesson assessment, are always a good exercise for any good student to use to prepare so that they can succeed on that test. Okay, that's it. Short and sweet. I hope it helps. Let me know if you need any help. Bye-bye.